Every revolution starts in the minds of the people. Arm yourself for the war of ideas. Take back your life. Take back your liberty. Tom Mullen Talks Freedom.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Tom Mullen Talks Freedom. Can you believe it? We made it here to episode 200 of the podcast, and I want to thank everybody who's been here since the beginning or near the beginning. And, of course, there was a time when there weren't a lot of podcasts coming in 2023 due to various business and personal reasons, but we've been rolling for the last year now, and appreciate everybody who stayed with us. And we're always getting new subscribers, so I should remind you right now, if you're not already a subscriber to the podcast, you can subscribe on any of the podcast apps, Apple, Google, Stitcher, and it's on dozens and dozens of them. I think all of them. And of course, you can subscribe to the YouTube channel, Tom Mullen Talks Freedom. If you're watching, I apologize. I'm not quite as ghosty white as I appear to be. I'm recording this in the morning, and my house is an old house. It was built in 1880. I have no good room in here. Back then, they built like 42 rooms in an average size house, and they all have windows all over the place. So depending on what time of day, I never have good lighting. But I know you don't tune in because of my good looks, so we'll get right to the point. I thought for the 200th episode, we would do something a little retrospective and look back at what was going on 5 years ago, almost to this day. And that, of course, is the very beginning of what I call the COVID atrocities, the tremendous harm the government inflicted on society, both our federal and state governments, which to no benefit whatsoever. And I mean, I guess the reason I want to bring this up, a lot of people might think, well, Tom, it's 2025. COVID is well into the rear view mirror. We don't have to worry about that anymore. I just don't agree. I agree. I maintain a precedent was set there. The government could do this or something similar at any time, probably will, because there have been no consequences for the people who perpetrated this atrocity on the citizens of the United States and most of the countries of the world. So I wanted to, just kind of review what happened during 2020 to 2022. I mean, there were still mask mandates in 2022 here in New York State, as incredible as that might seem. There was some good news about those mask mandates for the people of Western New York, excluding Erie County, deep blue Erie County, the county I was born in, but the county I do not live in now. So let's just start by saying what was going on March 12th, 2020. President Trump was still saying that, people should not panic. He was still saying that, I believe it was March 12th. I'm remembering the date of March 15th because we went out for lunch for my wife's birthday with my mother, who had just checked in to an assisted living facility. We had finally got her to agree to leave her house. She was definitely not in shape to be alone, and she didn't want to come and live with us at first because she felt she would be a burden. So, of course, that was not the case, and she did live with us for many years afterwards. But at the time, the best we could do was get her to agree to get her own apartment in an assisted living facility. And she had actually moved into this facility on March 7th of 2020. And somewhere around the 15th or 16th of March, we went out to lunch. And I got a call while we were at the restaurant that said, I know your mom is with you out to lunch, and I just want to let you know that once she comes back, I can't remember the words they used, but basically she was going to be locked in her apartment a week after she moved in. And I guess the first thing that I'd like to share is the results of a study that were published last year that of course got no media attention. And this was not a small study. It was done by professors at Stanford and Harvard, the usual, institutions. And what this study looked at, first of all, is that it looked at daily data on 16 government responses in 181 countries, 2020 to 2021, and four outcomes: cases, infections, COVID 19 deaths, and all cause excess deaths. Okay. And to construct 99,736 analytical models, and concluded we find no patterns in the overall set of models that suggests a clear relationship between COVID 19 government responses and outcomes. So, first of all, this study is very high level. One of the things you have to worry about with studies, and we're going to talk about the kinds of studies the government used to justify what it did, and this kind of study. This kind of study takes in so much data and is so above the noise that it eliminates all confounding variables. Okay. One of the things that was at issue during COVID was, are you going to listen to the science or not? Now, of course, there's no such thing as the science. Science is a method, the scientific method. And what it says is that you have a hypothesis and you gather data on it, and you try to formulate a theory from the data, and you try to institute controls so that when you're trying to establish a cause and effect relationship, you're eliminating other causes to the effects that you're seeing other than the one you're studying. Okay? So that's why they call it a controlled experiment. You're controlling for confounding variables. Well, this study looked at so much of the data, and of course they use controls in every aspect of it, but it looked at so much of the data, and especially when you look at things like all cause mortality, it gets above the confounding variables. Well, we looked at 20 people, and we had 15 COVID deaths. Of course, 14 of them were also hit by a car while they had COVID. So obviously there's a confounding variable in there. Of course, I'm just making that example up. But so this study last year is pretty conclusive. And it basically says that we would have been better off. Well, no, I shouldn't say that. That no COVID outcome was affected by what the government did. So, had the government done nothing, COVID outcomes would have been the same. Now, the official story is there's something like, I don't know, 6.8 or 7 million deaths from COVID in a certain defined period of many years. And I think maybe 1.6 million I'm going off the top of my head, in America. I don't believe those numbers. It's a little like inflation. Inflation's the opposite. The way they measure inflation now has all kinds of qualifiers to make the number lower, okay, than it was like in the 1970s. So when people say, well, we had the worst inflation since the 1970s, that's comparing the inflation as measured with one ruler stick now compared to the inflation as measured by a different ruler, back in the 70s. So obviously that's dishonest on its face. And nobody acknowledges that. Okay, so was the inflation over the last several years higher or lower than the 70s. Well, why doesn't somebody either go back and remeasure inflation using today's methodology and compare those two numbers, or measure today's inflation using the 1970s methodology? I think John Williams' Shadow Stats website still does that kind of thing. But you never hear anybody talk about it. People talk about inflation all the time in the media. I mean, I only hear about it secondhand because I don't watch the media. I see like clips posted by people, which I know are out of context, and I scan the websites of NBC News, CBS, CNN, New York Times, and generally get a sense of the bullshit they're pitching every day. And it's so easy to know what the gist of the story is. It used to be like you can't judge the story by the headline, but now that all news is just opinion and propaganda, you can really just read the headline. And when you do dive into the story, yeah, you find out that, the headline does represent what they're saying. You could usually kind of tease out where they're lying because they will, they'll take a fact and they'll try to cover themselves that what they're saying is technically true. And then they'll put such a spin on it that what the reader is hearing is not true at all. So, you know, that's the way they keep from just getting sued for defamation. They still do get sued for defamation. In fact, the guy, James O'Keefe, who used to be Project Veritas, now he's O'Keefe Media Group, OMG. He keeps winning lawsuits against he's got something called the Wall of Shame, where posts all the lawsuits he wins for defamation when they say he lied about something and it was actually true. So I don't want to get too far afield, but I mean, basically, nothing they said about COVID was true at the time. Nothing they're saying about COVID. People still talk about COVID like, oh, we were going through the pandemic. We weren't going through if the government never did anything about the pandemic and the media didn't start, propagandizing, no one would have known there was a pandemic. Well, what about all those deaths? Well, let me tell you, I think even the raw numbers are suspect. I used to use the raw numbers to show that, like, for example, even if you accept the 1.6 million, or I'm sorry, I think it's the 6.8 million death toll, and that's over more than 1 year for COVID, that's still a smaller percentage of the population than was killed by the 1968 flu pandemic. Okay, I bet you nobody's ever told you that. Well, maybe I've said it on this podcast, but it's true. Okay, so the 1968 flu pandemic killed about 0.1% of the world population. The COVID pandemic, even using their numbers, which are again not used with the same measuring methodology, so they're higher than they would be if you used 1968's measuring. Even using those numbers, they're less than the percentage of the population. It's less than 0.1% of the 7.8 billion person population of the earth. So it wasn't as bad, even when you accept all the skewed numbers. And if you got to the real number, you'd find out it was a nothing burger. Okay. Now, that's not to say that it wasn't something ginned up in a lab with gain of function testing. That's a whole other issue. I think it probably was. I'm almost certain it was, but it just didn't turn out to be that deadly. And a lot of people accept that. Last year during the election year, you heard people like Andrew Cuomo and even Mario Cuomo, who wants to make a comeback someday. And of course, that's never impossible in American politics, backing away from his COVID measures, tried to say they were really voluntary. Okay. And that's because it's starting to dawn on people what a travesty COVID was. Okay. But whatever you think about it, even if you think it was a terribly deadly pandemic, none of the things the government did, lockdowns, mask mandates, vaccine mandates, all the hand washing, all of that stuff, none of it, zero. It did nothing. It didn't change the outcomes at all. That's what the science says, okay? And I use that term in quotes for people not watching the video. That's what people employing the scientific method on a real data set, a large one, looking at a hundred, what was it? How many different countries? 181 countries, 16 different methodologies, okay, controlling for all the skewed studies that they showed. That's what they found. It did nothing, but it did do, they only measured, did it make a difference for COVID? They didn't measure the societal effects, and it did a lot of harm, a lot. Um, Now, the general story is that the economy, recovered from this. Of course, Trump wants to say it was the back to being the greatest economy ever before he left office, and then Biden, wants to say how much better it was than, during Trump's term while he was president. But let's just take a look at one. We know that, millions of jobs were destroyed, and millions of businesses were put out of business, some forever. Okay. I want to talk about jobs for a minute, because jobs, contrary to what people might think, never recovered from COVID. You know what? Before I get to that, I just want to say one other thing. Lockdowns, about the studies. So the study that I'm citing, that I'll link to, or maybe I'll link to my article that links to the study just so I can get some traffic out of this. But the study that found that COVID did nothing was based on, what I said, very expansive, taking in as much data as were available. The study that established the idea that COVID was spread asymptomatically, because you remember a big part of the reason for lockdowns was this idea that there was widespread asymptomatic spread for COVID. And you know what that study was, what study that was based on? It wasn't even a study. It was a case. It was a case of a Chinese woman, one woman in Germany, who supposedly spread COVID to 4 other people, and that she didn't have symptoms. She was asymptomatic. Okay. So they post this as a study on one of the magazines. It was either Science or one of the journals, a respected magazine. And Fauci announces that this quote unquote study, this case of one person spreading it without symptoms, closes the door on the issue that COVID is spread asymptomatically. And here's the punchline. Later on, it turned out that the woman in question had never been interviewed. No one ever asked her if she had symptoms. And when they finally did, she said, yes, yeah, I had symptoms. And then they unpublished the study. They took it down. But they never changed the idea that COVID was spread asymptomatically. Okay, well, during 2020, I was ghostwriting a book for somebody who, among other things, has a PhD in epidemiology, who at the beginning of this thought nobody was taking COVID seriously enough. And of course, asymptomatic spread was something we were very interested in. So real time during COVID, I'm watching the government websites, the NIH and CDC websites. And the NIH is where they are publishing the breaking studies on this. And one after another would come out with a headline like something to the effect of COVID may be spread asymptomatically. And then when you looked at the study, they would have statements like, we haven't been able to confirm a single case. So right on the NIH website, it was saying we can't confirm any asymptomatic spread. And yet these studies would come out, and Fauci would go on talking about COVID like it was spread asymptomatically. Like the same day he would be appearing after one after another study failed to confirm this. Well, they finally did a retrospective study, and I'll link to this in 2021 or 22. And it looked at what they call secondary attack rates for COVID. And what that means is for people who live in the same house, what was the percentage of people who got infected by that person with COVID in the same house? Now, remember, lockdowns kept us all in the same house. Okay. And there was something in 2020 where even Cuomo comes out and announces, hey, geez, we just found out that almost all the spread from COVID is inside the household. People, quote unquote, doing the right thing, staying home. So he confirms that staying home does not save lives. Get that stupid fucking meme off of your Facebook page, okay? But then he goes on with the same policy like it never happened. But that was just, something real time that was happening. Okay, so this retrospective study found that if you had COVID, do you know what the asymptomatic spread was inside your household if you had COVID? 0.7%, less than 1%, well within the margin of error, which means it very well could be zero. Okay. So there was no asymptomatic spread. And if there was no asymptomatic spread, there was no justification for lockdowns. Now, even if there was asymptomatic spread, there wouldn't have been no justification for lockdowns. I'll get to that in a minute. But in any case, by their reasoning, which was that we have to lock down society because people are spreading this asymptomatically. They don't even know they have it, and they're spreading it to other people. No, didn't happen. So even by their own reasoning, it wasn't justified. According to scientific study, and it wasn't the only one, by the way, all during COVID, there were many studies, smaller ones, showing the lockdowns were not helping. They were not improving the outcomes we would have if the government did nothing. And then this one really does close the book on whether lockdowns did anything, and not just lockdowns, mask mandates. They looked at all of it. Nothing. Did nothing. Someone has to pay for this, or they're going to do it again, or they're going to do something like it again. Maybe for climate change. It's an emergency. Okay. So when I said it, even if it was spread asymptomatically, it wouldn't have been justified. There's a premise here that, the government has this legitimate power to do something if you might be spreading a disease, and it doesn't. People spread diseases all the time. They have throughout all of history. That doesn't give the government a right to lock you in your house. In a theoretical world without government, it wouldn't give your fellow citizens a right to lock everyone in their house. Okay, you have a right individually to stay in your house, to lock yourself down. Okay, and you don't have a right to force other people to pay you to stay home because you're afraid to catch a disease. All right, property owners have a right to close their business because they're afraid their business might be spreading a disease to their coworkers, to the public. No, you don't have a right to close down that business. You have a right not to go there or not to go to any business, to lock yourself down. Okay, this is the premise of a free society. All right? You're not guaranteed to be insulated from any harm, including a contagious disease. All right, if you don't believe that, you don't believe in a free society. You don't believe in property rights. You don't believe that people own themselves, which is the foundation of all property rights, unless you believe it. So philosophically, there is no basis here to do this. Like, well, if it was a worse pandemic, no. Even then, no. Okay. But again, there was no asymptomatic spread. If it was minuscule, nothing that justified lockdowns by their reasoning. And that needs to be relitigated. These things have to be understood by the public. Okay. And in the end, I blame the public. It's all the people with those stupid, I got my vaccine, stay home, it could save lives. When you're doing that, you're telling the regime that is oppressing people, I'm giving you my consent. Because without that, they wouldn't do it. Was there an answer to lockdowns? Yeah, stay open, keep your business open. They couldn't come and arrest everybody. That's always the answer. So ultimately, this is the public's fault. Our public is way, way too statist, socialist. They believe all the economic fallacies. And at the end, they want to believe it because they resent people that are doing better than them. That's at the heart of all of this. It's why people wanted to see businesses locked down because they resent the owners of the businesses. Let's just be honest for a minute here, okay? And that's at the root of all socialist movements. They just resent the people. I saw a great clip from, I think it was George Bernard Shaw. It might have been somebody. No, it wasn't. It was another socialist leader, but he was at least saying Marx was wrong because it was based on resentment of the bourgeois. The name escapes me, but it was another of these supposedly enlightened socialist liberals of the 20th century. So I can't cover everything. There's also evidence mask mandates did no good and that they do harm, especially masking children harms them physically, developmentally, just terrible. Everything about this was all pain and no gain. And at about half the public not only went along with it, but shouted down and are still jeering at anyone who showed the least bit of dissent. Okay. And that's why it really is your neighbor's fault. Why we have a $6.5 trillion, $7 trillion government now, and that just keeps getting worse. That's why. But there are people in the government who we need to hold accountable. I mean, Fauci's one. He's been pardoned. I don't really care if he gets prosecuted or gets put in jail. I mean, it's not going to help anything that an 80-some-year-old man gets thrown in jail for the rest of his life. But I'd like to see it relitigated in the public square and a general acknowledgement that this was an atrocity and that did no good. It did a lot of harm. And I think the last thing I'll cover is jobs, just because there's a general sense, well, it did a lot of harm and then we recovered and now it's in the rearview mirror. And if there is any problem, it's going to be Trump's tariffs or something. And, I've said enough negative about Trump's tariffs. They're really stupid. Tariffs are always stupid. They never help. They don't protect anything. They never have in hundreds of years of employing mercantilism. It's never worked, never once. It's just like socialism. Okay. It's a different dumb economic theory, but it's a dumb economic theory. It's also unjust. It violates the rights of the individual. Okay. So it's all the things socialism is and just as harmful, maybe not as harmful, actually. I shouldn't say that. Socialism's really freaking harmful, and mercantilism is not quite as, we found in American history where we've had mercantilism doing harm, but it can be overcome. And I think that's where I was going, arguing if there was an argument for Trump is better than Biden, it's like he's going to be mercantilist, and that's bad, but he's also going to be better on some other things. And Biden's going to be socialist, and that's worse. And so you might have a net less negative effect from Trump. But I just want to talk about jobs because, according to the government jobs report, and I just did this for all of you before I came on the mic today. I redid this because I've done it before, and they keep changing the numbers retrospectively, and not just like last month's numbers, but they've gone for a couple of years and gone back and changed by over 1 million how many jobs were created. So during Biden's term, they were, oh, look, we created 500,000 jobs. And later you find out, no, it was 170, or I'm just making up that number, but it was drastic changes. One number that the difference between what they said was created and what was actually created was over 800,000. Okay. So let me give you some perspective. We lost 21 million jobs, almost 22 million, 21,868,000 jobs between March and April of 2020, 5 years ago. And then, of course, after that, once they started opening up some parts of the economy, we started gaining jobs back in large numbers. And of course, during Trump's term, I don't think he was dishonest enough to say that like the 2.6 million jobs created in quotes in May were really new jobs. They're just people coming back to work. The few out of the 20 million that were allowed to come back after the initial part of the lockdowns, after the 22 million were sent home, they did let 2 million come back right away. But now there's still 20 million locked up, right? Now, during this time, some jobs are eliminated forever, and then some new jobs are created. But on net, the government did not get back to making up those 22 million jobs by the end of 2020? No. By the end of 2021? No. The government didn't come back to even where, those jobs were back until June of 2022. Okay, so more than 2 years just to get back to the number of jobs created. All right, and you might say, okay, that was terrible. But they finally did get those jobs back, and now we've created millions of jobs since. No, that's not the right way to look at this at all. Because it's not just the jobs that we had in February of 2020 that were lost in the next 2 months. It's all the jobs that weren't created. So I went and looked at the previous 5 years. And I think I've said this before, the average number of jobs that should have been created or that were created on average per month for the previous 5 years to COVID was 170 million jobs. And you have to remember there's a certain amount of jobs, 170,000 per month, not 170 million. 170,000 per month. There's a certain amount of jobs per month that you have to create new for the economy to maintain employment because the population keeps growing, and it has kept growing since 2020. All right. It's much bigger now. So, but even using the average number of jobs, 170,000 in the 5 years previous to 2020, had the government done nothing and no jobs lost during that period, we would have created on net 10,200,000 new jobs from March 2020 till the end of February 2025. Okay. What did we actually create? Counting all the millions that came back and the new ones that were created after, 6.8 million. So we're down, what is that? 3.4 million jobs on net. We're still down, haven't made up since COVID. Okay. And these things start to come out. They'll say, oh, look, we created 2 million jobs this year. But then you look at the number of people employed and it's the same as it was last year. But the population's bigger. Are you following me? They're lying to you. We have still not recovered economically from COVID on the jobs front. We may never recover. All right. So, there's also the recession number. Are we or are we not in a recession? Okay. Which one little government set of bureaucrats, no different than USAID or the other scams that Doge has been exposing, decides that based on all these formulas and whatever. Well, We haven't gained any more people employed, and the population keeps getting bigger. All through immigration, by the way, because the native born population is not replacing itself. So if we had zero immigration, the population would be getting smaller. That's how much immigration we have. So we'll get to that in a different podcast. But in any case, we're not employing people, okay, on net. We haven't recovered economically from COVID. There's a case to be made that we've been in one long depression, not recession. There's really no difference between those words. They just don't like to say depression after the Great Depression because it'll scare people. But whatever. Call it a recession. You could make a case we've been in a recession since 2008. It just never really ended. Okay. But in any case, this did tremendous economic harm. It was a tremendous injustice. There's people, millions of lives were ruined. People whose businesses are gone forever. Generally, society is worse. I can tell you that when you live in a blue state like I do, it's palpably worse. And you can see the businesses that are gone. One thing about Western New York is they had a lot at this, the greatest cheap food in the country. And I've traveled most of the country, like the diner that you go into, and the food is just awesome. And it's been run by the same family for going on a century, and the kids are running it. There's so many of those that are gone around here. Generally, and I remember when I started traveling to Germany in 2004-ish, and I traveled there for several years, the next 4 or 5 years, when I was in the hearing aid business. I was always marveled at how many places were closed after 7 o'clock, after 6 o'clock. How many restaurants were it's like you're closed. It's a restaurant, and even convenience stores and all kinds of things. And of course, this is because, their socialism, basically, their central planning of the economy, their regulations on labor, their high labor costs, all these things. And now Western New York feels a lot like Germany did. The minimum wages are high. Minimum wage here is like $15.50. Okay. So, that affects me personally. It affects everything. And they still can't get people to come to work for this. And that's a whole other story. Part of the reason is there aren't as many young people around. All right. Not qualified people, because we keep having less children. And that's who goes to work in a lot of these minimum wage jobs. But in any case, things are closed. Restaurants are closed on Monday and Tuesday. We're closed. We're closed at 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock on weeknights. It just never used to be like this. So, we're a much poorer country. Sometimes people don't realize they're poor because they see the number in their paycheck and they don't consider, what does your money buy? What's available for you to consume? A lot less. And this is just what some ideological people want. They want us to be poorer. They don't like people. They want lower populations. They want us to have less things to. Bernie Sanders says there's too many choices, too many different kinds of soap or graham crackers or whatever in the economy, because he's a communist. Okay, that's how these people don't like people. That was true of Marx. It's true of, deep down, it's true of all of them. Okay, that's why these people are very unhappy with themselves, with their own lives. And that's why they cheered on this atrocity committed against us 5 years ago. It's got to be relitigated somehow or other amidst all these investigations. If we already know that Doge isn't going to cut spending because Congress is going to keep approving higher spending, and the president's going to sign it saying we just can't do anything right now. He's out there castigating Thomas Massie for voting no, even though the bill already passed. It's already a done deal. And he's still out there trying to get Massie out of Congress for voting no, like Ron Paul used to. And I think it was Spike Cohen who had a great post who says, you know what? Back in 2002, He was, I guess Spike at one time was a neocon. It's hard to believe, but he says he was. I take his word. And he was like, against Ron Paul, resisting the nonsense then, the war on terror and the spending and everything else. And he, used to talk about Ron like Trump and a bunch of MAGA people talk about Massey. And he's like, I was dead wrong. And a lot of people now, including most of MAGA, admits they were dead wrong about Ron Paul. Well, you know what? In 20 years, it'll be too late to admit you were wrong about Thomas Massey, but you are. And let me give a shout out to all MAGA people who are saying, no, you're Trump, I support you, but you're wrong about Thomas Massey. There's a lot of them. And there's a lot of high profile people. Matt Walsh. Amen, Matt. Good on you for saying, look, I'm a Trump supporter. He's wrong about this because he is. Well, Trump's wrong about a lot of things. And I voted for the idiot. But in any case, he's also right about a lot of things. He has pretty good instincts on a lot of things. And unfortunately, he has the attention span of a gnat. So whoever talked to him last sometimes can influence him to even go against his own instincts, which they're doing on this spending bill. Although, government shutdowns are treated like the end of the world. So he doesn't want to pay a political price on that. So he wants to rubber stamp this one. So in any case, Massey, of course, is right about everything he talks about on as far as politics, just like Ron Paul was, because he's basically the new Ron Paul and the only no vote, just like Ron Paul was called Dr. No. So if you're having any second thoughts or any of the crap they bring up, like, oh, he did vote for this, when you get to the bottom of all those, it's bullshit. Just like COVID was, just like everything is. It's just, pro-Trump bullshit in this case. One of them was that he had voted for a CR, continuing revolution under McCarthy. Yeah, that one didn't pass. The one he voted for, and it would have cut all domestic spending by 8 or 10%. And that's why he voted for it. I think it was 8%. Okay. And he posted that. She posted the link. He posted the receipts. So that's all crap. So Trump's just totally wrong about this, like he is on tariffs. He was totally right on COVID before he flipped. He's totally right on Ukraine. Of course, he's waffling on that too, towing the line about punishing Putin. He seems to feel he has to adopt this. We never would have had the Ukraine war because I'm tougher than Joe Biden and Putin wouldn't have dared. The real reason is because Trump had a sensible approach to Russia and wouldn't have been as aggressive, would never have signed off on bombing civilians, which is the reason that the straw that broke the camel's back for Putin invading in the first place. That's why it wouldn't have happened. And to a certain extent, Trump says these things, number one, because he likes the sound of it, but number two, because that's what people want to hear. So again, it's the public's fault. They want to hear this dumb Putin is Hitler narrative, that it takes a strong president to keep him in line. No, what it takes is treating them like a country, not bombing civilians on their border, not doing troop exercises in Ukraine on their border, marching down the same roads Hitler used to invade them. That's what it takes to not have an invasion. Okay. And a deal saying you won't let the equivalent of Mexico for them enter an alliance that includes NATO missiles in Ukraine. That's what it takes. So I'm off the subject of COVID. Let's rein it in by saying sometime, if there's any good that comes out of the Trump presidency, one of the things has to be that COVID is revisited and it's generally acknowledged that this was a huge mistake at best, atrocity at worst. Lockdowns didn't work. There was no asymptomatic spread. Mask mandates didn't do anything but harm. And as I didn't get to the vaccine, of course, mandating the vaccine, which was part of that study, did no good. It changed no outcomes. It didn't change COVID outcomes. It didn't change all-cause death outcomes. I'm rather agnostic on whether the vaccine is as deadly as some people say it is. put it this way, I have to rely on my anecdotal experience. I know one person who died of COVID, and that person was very sick before they got COVID. And I don't know anybody who died from the vaccine, and most of the people I know got it. I do know a few people who may have died from it. That's very suspicious that they died at their age and their relative healthiness for their age. They died inexplicably. Two people I knew, but I'm not going to say that was the vaccine because I don't know that. I think the death rate from the vaccine's higher than it is for other vaccines, probably. The bar for safety for vaccines is pretty high, okay, except for the COVID vaccine. That all of a sudden the bar is really low. So, and there's all kinds of problems with the data on that and everything. So all I'll say is, look, if you got the vaccine, fine. I hope that it never harms you. It didn't do any good. The good that it even by official standards did was very limited for a very short period of time. It didn't prevent spread ultimately. So, it wasn't really a vaccine by the definition we used to know vaccine, which I get this, I won't catch the disease. Okay. But I'm really more concerned with, because I don't want the government banning anything that's ineffective. I just don't want them mandating anything. And of course, the mandates did no good at all harm. And a lot of people lost their jobs, and that was pure evil. Probably the most evil thing. It's a tough call between lockdowns and mandating that someone actually gets something injected into their body. Atrocity. People have to be held accountable for that. So hopefully this provided some information that you didn't already know. There'll be links at tommullentalksfreedom.com. And I can't remember my server, my distributor changed. It's not just .com/200 anymore. There's something after it. But if you go to tommullentalksfreedom.com, just click podcast. You can get to the podcast show notes. There's also a link to that page on the YouTube video. So I invite you to go in and look at some of the data, and I'll post some of the things I was writing during 2020. And you don't take me at my word. Go try to prove me wrong. You're going to find out this was an atrocity, and there has to be a reckoning. So again, don't forget, like this podcast, share the video or a link to the show, and we'll see you next time on Tom Mullen Talks Freedom.
The war of ideas has only just begun. Arm yourself with the knowledge you need by heading to tommullentalksfreedom.com and subscribing to our email list. And remember, every revolution starts in the minds of the people.